In the second part of our unit on the vestibular system, we'll take a look at how the central nervous system organizes and reacts upon the information that's provided from the structures contained within the inner ear. And I'm referring to just generally what are called the central vestibular pathways. And these are pathways that are involved in coordinating information coming from the inner ear, which transmits information related to head and body position and movement. And the response here is to control or to inhibit motor neurons that affect movement of our head, our eyes, and the rest of our body. So through the adjustment of head, eye, and body positions, we'll be able to reestablish either static or dynamic postural control and equilibrium. And this operates through cranial nerve 8. So vestibular axons travel through this nerve and will connect directly to various portions of the vestibular nuclei, which are contained within the brainstem. And so when I talk about a direct connection, there is no synaptic connection between the axons that emerge from the otolith and the semicircular canals, the otolith organs and the semicircular canals, to their termination onto the vestibular nuclei. At that point, they will then synapse and indirectly connect to various other neurons contained within the central nervous system. And so one such indirect connection is to the cerebellum, and we'll, as an example, and we'll talk about some of these other indirect connections. But when you think about the difference between a direct connection and an indirect connection, which arises from the sensory organs, the sensory organs will connect to the cerebellum indirectly through various synaptic connections, whereas the direct connection without a synapse occurs from the sensory organs onto the vestibular nuclei. So the vestibular nuclei in this illustration here, just very generally depicted, receives inputs, of course, from the vestibular nerve, as we talked about, receives inputs from the cerebellum, from the visual system, as well as the somatosensory system. So lots of information is coming into this cluster of cell bodies, which will then project to the brain and spinal cord. So specifically, when we take a look at the otolith organs, they will project specifically to lateral vestibular nuclei, and they will merge into what's generally referred to as the vestibulospinal tract. As the name indicates, we're looking at information transmitted from the from the vestibular organs through into the spinal cord. And so this is a fairly rapid, somewhat stereotyped movement in which we can quickly translate information regarding our head position with respect to gravity, linear accelerations, to activating muscles in our legs that are primarily involved in postural control. And so that's what we see here depicted on this illustration, where the two separate portions of the otolith organs will transmit through the vestibular nerve. This one is a little bit lower here, but it will terminate on those lateral nuclei of the vestibular nuclei, and will then descend through vestibulospinal tracts, terminating onto and synapsing onto alpha motor neurons that will eventually control the muscles in our legs. With respect to the semicircular canals, these project to superior and medial vestibular nuclei. Their job, as mentioned earlier, they are particularly sensitive to head rotations in space, so around the three principal axes of movement, of rotation rather. and they will form part of what's called the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is a cluster of axons that merges from axons from the visual system bilaterally at the brainstem level. These projections will then continue and synapse onto spinal motor neurons, particularly those motor neurons that control muscles in our trunk and our neck. The medial projections are typically excitatory, while the superior ones are the axons that will eventually discharge neurons in the superior portion are inhibitory. And so in order to execute a smooth movement, an efficient movement that is a response to a perturbation in our trunk and our neck muscles, that's going to occur when we activate muscles that will drive the movement in the direction that is appropriate to react to recover from the perturbation, while inhibiting those muscles that would tend to move us in the direction of that perturbation. And so the inhibitory signals are just as important as the excitatory signals, so that we can produce those smooth and efficient movements. And so depicted here, we see action potentials generated from the semicircular canals terminating onto various portions of the vestibular nuclei that will eventually result in the activation of neurons controlling our head and our trunk. There's not a whole lot to memorize from this one slide. This slide is just meant to illustrate a summary of inputs from the sensory organs contained within the inner ear as part of the vestibular system, and we see that these organs will directly terminate onto the vestibular nuclei. This illustration here suggests a direct connection to the cerebellum, but there are synaptic connections that would eventually work to the cerebellum. So the connection from these axons to the cerebellum are considered indirect, while the connections to the vestibular nuclei are considered direct. And so through the vestibular nuclei, we see projections that do continue on to the cerebellum. Information is transmitted to the somatosensory cortex, as we've discussed previously, that moves through relay nuclei in the thalamus. The extraocular motor neurons will also receive synaptic connections from the information coming from the vestibular apparatus, as well as connections are made through the vestibulospinal tract to control limb and neck motor neurons. And so experimentally, a unique way to activate the sensory organs experimentally is through what we refer to as vestibular stimulation. And so this is referred to as galvanic or electrical vestibular stimulation. And so as you can see on this illustration, here we see an electric stimulator that is providing current to stimulating electrodes that are positioned right behind the ears over the surface of the posterior region of the skull, which will then be able to transmit that electrical information to the selective activation of the sensory organs. And so this will activate fibers of the vestibular nerve, and typically this is it's a direct current that is often applied. An alternating current can also be used in terms of galvanic vestibular stimulation. But nevertheless, the result here is this does result in the activation of central vestibular neurons, simulating semicircular canal and otolith organ activation. there is a question of whether this activation is either selective for one particular type of sensory organ or not. That answer has not been conclusive yet. So one of the criticisms of this technique to use experimentally is that it results in non-selective activation. So basically what happens when we apply this electric stimulation is that a person will generate a conscious perception that their body is moving, either tilting in one direction or the other, to the right or to the left. And because we're activating the vestibular neurons, it will often result in some degree of ocular movement. So as a general understanding, most people will not perceive body rotations, which is a function of the semicircular canals, which gives rise to the suggestion that perhaps this type of stimulation is selected to the otolith organs, but as I mentioned earlier, that conclusion has not received wide agreement. So basically, the body will respond. It will react in the opposite direction, and so if a person perceives motion tilting in the right direction, they will tend to lean towards their left side, despite the fact that their body did not actually move in the right direction. And so this technique was used in this study examining the vestibular control of balance in a group of patients that experienced a middle cerebral artery stroke, which is one of the more common types of strokes that people experience. And so in this particular study, they sampled 16 patients and 10 matched healthy participants, age matched. So the major task here is they had their research participants, their patients and their healthy controls stand just in a double-legged stance on two separate force plates, one for the right foot, one for the left foot, and they stood with their eyes closed. And while they stood with their eyes closed, they applied a 3-second period of stimulation to the vestibular nerve through the mastoid processes. What was measured was body motion through motion analysis, and so they measured body sway, which specifically was mediolateral sway, so tilting to the right, tilting to the left, and they measured laterally applied ground reaction forces. And so as our body sways when we're standing, we apply force against the ground, and if we're standing on a force plate, that force plate will be able to detect the magnitude and direction of that force. But in this study, the examination was limited to laterally directed ground reaction forces through those force plates. And so the results demonstrated that the patients that had experienced a stroke reacted to a much greater extent to vestibular stimulation with respect to medial lateral sway. That is basically moving the body from right to left. The lateral impulse is a measurement of the ground reaction force from the force plate, and they found that in response to galvanic vestibular stimulation, that was greater in the stroke group. The study also found a greater initial lateral impulse for the non-paretic leg, the leg that was not affected by the stroke, as a means of trying to reestablish what was perceived to be a perturbation to standing equilibrium. And so in this graph here, this is a summary of the results generated from the study. And so we see here in the patients that had experienced stroke, at the onset of the stimulation, once again this was for a very short period of time, we see that the body movement of the head, a marker was placed on C7, and the pelvis all experienced rather significant sways, movements to the opposite side of the stimulation. Those participants that were not affected by stroke, that were considered to be healthy in that regard, they did experience a sway in the same direction as those patients that had experienced stroke, but to a much less magnitude. In terms of lateral axial displacement, in terms of the summated lateral reaction force, this graph illustrates the large impulse. This is basically a tracing of the laterally applied ground reaction force, much greater here than was observed in the control patients. So following galvanic stimulation, the healthy patients, or the healthy participants, still experienced that sway, but to a much lesser extent than the patients that had experienced stroke. We see that those healthy participants following galvanic stimulation still produced that lateral perturbation, but they were still able to produce and maintain a relative balance between the right and left leg in terms of the forces applied to the ground. The patients that had experienced stroke, however, we observed that the large deviations in the applied reaction force was much greater in the non-paretic leg than the paretic leg, as a means of trying to use the stronger leg, the non-affected leg, as a means of maintaining stability to that perceived perturbation. And this graph illustrates a measurement of the ground reaction force, which is just simply referred to as the impulse, which is the force multiplied by the time over which that force was measured. And we see that in terms of the non-paretic leg and the paretic leg, the X indicates the patients that had experienced stroke. The circles were the healthy participants. We see that the impulse to galvanic vestibular stimulation resulted in a very large disturbance in bilateral control for the stroke patients, but healthy patients, despite some lateral movements, were still able to maintain symmetry in their applied forces through their right and left leg. So this ends the second part of our lecture on the vestibular system. The third part will address the vestibulo-ocular reflex.